Hello everyone. Welcome to our webinar. My name is Debbie and I'm really glad you all can be here with us today for a visit with Kolie Moore as he discusses sprint training with WKO4. You may already know Kolie from the WKO4 Power Users Facebook group, and if you do, you probably already know that sprint is one of his areas of expertise. So he has a lot to share with us today, and I'm glad that you can be here with us. If you'd like to download his handouts, you can do so right from your webinar screen, the handout section. And we're also going to be emailing you a link to download them shortly after the webinar ends, so you will get that link as well. And you're going to see some custom charts that Kolie uses in his webinar, and those charts have been added to the WKO4 library so that you can download them and use them right away. So be sure to check that out. If you have any questions as Kolie presents, feel free to type those questions into the chat box, and at the end we'll have a question and answer session, and we can look over those questions and hopefully answer them then. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kolie Moore. Kolie, I'm going to switch the screen to you, and you should see a question asking you to show your screen.
Okie dokie. I'm having a minor technical difficulty, so just bear with me for 1 second.
There we go.
Okie dokie. All right. So excellent. All right. Question box is up. And all right, here we go. So welcome everybody. As usual, type questions as we go, and I'll try to get to them during the presentation, or I'll wait until the end. If I do not get to your question, my email is at the end of the presentation, so please email me. So releasing the power of sprint training with WKO4. So this is my analytical approach to strength, sprinting, and speed. And tonight, or today, if you're on the East Coast here in the U.S., my goals are to show you all the primary drivers of sprinting ability, and then we're going to talk about those in terms of determining athlete-specific needs for individualized programming, and then I'm going to introduce some methods and tools for tracking sprint performance. So, what is sprinting? Sprinting is a series of repeated, holistic, unilateral contractions to achieve top speed. And I chose this. I chose these words very carefully, which is why it's a little clunky, because I wrote this definition. Repeated, obviously, we need to pedal over and over again. You can't just stomp once and you're there. Holistic is a word we see in the scientific literature all the time that describes muscular contractions that are intended to achieve maximal force and velocity, and unilateral contractions, meaning one side at a time, to achieve top speed. Because in most sprinting, for at least road and stuff like that, the idea is to achieve top speed. Although not all sprints or not all ballistic contractions are meant to achieve top speed, and we'll see some examples of that in other disciplines. Sprinting is also the product of evolvable force and leg speed. I also chose the word evolvable because power and force on the pedals is not on and off like a light switch. It develops over time and falls off over time, so this is important to keep in mind. And it's not a product of maximal force and maximal leg speed, because those are actually kind of at two different ends of what's called the force velocity curve, and I'll show you guys that in a little bit. Just to get an idea of what we're talking about here, what is sprinting? Let's look at a typical sprint from the end of a criterium. So here we have, the athlete coast through the final corner and starts sprinting, and we see the power immediately come up to about 1100 to 1300 watts, and then it drops off pretty steadily. We see the speed increasing, which is obviously the end goal of a sprint. Here in this graphical sprint analysis chart, on the top, this is how I look at most sprints. I have power, CPV, circumferential pedal velocity, AEPF, average effective pedal force, cadence, and speed. And the reason I have CPV and AEPF here is because when you go to the gym and you do velocity targeting, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, movement trackers and bar trackers for strength exercises and explosive exercises in the gym will report speed and force and power in meters per second and newtons and watts. So it's important to me to be able to relate the speed of the leg contraction in a bike race to the training contraction speed. And I'll talk about a little bit more why that's important later. So on the bottom here, for useful child charts, we have the classic WKO4 acceleration chart and quadrant analysis. And I also have CPV versus power and AEPF versus cadence, which are just two different, those are three different ways besides the acceleration chart of looking at pretty much the same thing. They're all scatter plots. And we'll see an example of that in use a little bit later. So a little bit of review. We have key metrics. So we have Pmax. Pmax is the maximum average watts producible in one full pedal revolution. This is achieved while standing with optimal triple extension, force, and velocity. So what I'm talking about here is with triple extension is hip, knee, ankle. So 3 joints extending at optimal force and velocity, not maximal, optimal. RPM optimal here, I'll show you guys how to find that in a little bit, is the cadence at which you will hit your Pmax. The main fuel for sprints is stored ATP and phosphocreatine, and FRC here, functional reserve capacity. This is the energy available to work over threshold. The expenditure rate is capped by Pmax. So if your FRC gets stuck at some point during training, you may need to increase your Pmax. High FRC riders have a long sprint, a good last lap attack, or a good kilometer time trial. And the main fuel for FRC is the anaerobic breakdown of glucose. So when we talk about sprinting and training for sprinting, we really need to think about the mechanics of sprint pedaling. Because how we apply force and power to the pedals is extremely important. It's not it's as much about that as it is about how many watts you can do. So in terms of cadence, optimum Pmax pedaling rate is 100 to 120 RPM for road riders, but can vary. I've seen it as low as 95 RPM for some athletes. I've seen it as high as 130, 140 RPM. And in the average population, people who are untrained, it's generally about 120 RPM is the average. So tonight for this webinar, I'm going to actually use 120 RPM as a general stand-in for RPM optimal. So if I'm talking about that, you can just, if you know what yours is already, you can just substitute that in your head. So at 120 RPM, muscles have about 125 milliseconds to develop peak force. This is the first quarter of the pedal stroke. So we have a very short amount of time, and I'll prove this to you in a slide. Track sprinters, sorry you guys don't get more love in these webinars, but I'll try. So track sprinters need to develop power at very high cadence, over 140 RPM. So you have even less time to develop high force on the pedals. In terms of power, peak power within a pedal revolution is significantly greater than Pmax, and I'm talking 150 to 180%. We'll see an example of this. Seated Pmax usually occurs at a similar or higher cadence, and this is usually it's going to be a lower power value because you don't get to engage your upper body and move the bike and everything like that. And crank length may not be a significant factor in Pmax as standard crank sizes. So opinion alert here. but I've seen some pretty convincing but not ironclad evidence that this is the case. So, in case somebody's wondering about crank lengths, I strongly recommend that you just get them to fit and make sure you're not going to, pedal strike in your local velodrome, stuff like that. And then after that, then you can worry about power. So in detail, on the left graph here, we have the dark line is some scientists were modeling all the muscles of a leg to try to predict the behavior of force on the pedals during sprint cycling. But what I really want to show you here is the dotted lines here. So this is a couple pedal revolutions of an actual sprint at Pmax at 120 RPM. So what we're looking at here is at about 0 to 10 degrees here, there's not a lot of force on the pedals. And then by about 90 degrees, we've reached peak. And then it stays steady for a couple degrees, and then it drops off again. So just to make the calculation simple, this is that first quarter pedal stroke I'm talking about. So this is at 120 RPM, this is 125 milliseconds. So this is going to have pretty profound implications for sprint training later on. And on the right here, we have each of these larger humps is power throughout individual pedal strokes. So we see that that this athlete, at peak force is producing well over 2,000 watts. However, the middle line here is an average of the one pedal stroke average. So this would be your Pmax. So this rider is about 1,500 watts Pmax, but within each pedal stroke is able to produce over 2,000 watts. And when we look at stuff in the gym, we're actually going to see that people are definitely capable of producing 4, 5, 6,000, 10,000 watts per peak. Now, talking about training for sprinting, it's my personal philosophy that all training is an exaggeration of one performance aspect to elicit an adaptive response. So this, to me, this means no tweener workouts. Don't go namby-pamby, kind of half of this, half of that. Stress one thing and let it recover. And everything I go through from here really relies on that principle. So first, I want to talk about training adaptations that are specific to both velocity and intention. So with velocity, the first thing we need to look at is the force-velocity curve. So here we have newtons on the x-axis, that's force, and on the y-axis for velocity we have meters per second. So to imagine this, the force-velocity curve in cycling terms, let's imagine on the far left side, we have high velocity, low force. This is like putting your bike on a trainer, not cinching up the resistance unit and sprinting. So you're going to be doing 200 RPM at 11 watts. And on the opposite side, we've got high force, low velocity. So imagine doing a standing start in 53.11. So that first couple pedal strokes is going to be very high force, low velocity. And I can tell you're already thinking, so sprinting must be, optimal sprinting must be somewhere in the middle. And that's correct, and we're going to see that in a little bit. But one of the reasons I like this force velocity graph is because it divides up the training of the force velocity curve into the three sections where I really think about training. So I think about high velocity, low force training, ballistic training in the middle here, medium load, and very heavy load strength training. And we can actually see this on the bike in WKO4. And so thanks to William Renfro for helping me write the expressions for these charts. Those of you who know him from the Facebook group know he's kind of a wizard with this stuff. So so this is your force velocity SLR. There is a version of this that is very rough. but this is the smoothed out version that's easier to look at, especially when comparing several force velocity curves from an athlete when you're comparing periodization. We're going to see some of that a little later too. But what I want to point out is in the upper right here, we have F naught, which is where the curve intercepts the y-axis. We have meters per second naught, which is where the curve intercepts the x-axis. We have SFV, the slope of the force velocity curve, which is just the slope of the SLR. And these are all meant to be descriptive and not prescriptive. So in no way does an F naught of 1177 newtons mean that that is the maximal force this athlete can produce. Odds are it is not the maximal force this athlete can produce. The athlete can likely produce higher. So, so one of the implications of the force velocity curve is that if we multiply the two axes together, we multiply meters per second by newtons, we get Newton meters per second, which are the constituent units of watts. So we can actually see a parabola form when we multiply the two axes together, and it looks like this. So going from the original curved force velocity graph, we see a slightly skewed power curve here, and on the bike, of course, because the force velocity graph is linear, we actually get a very even parabola. And it looks like this. So this is the same athlete as I just showed you for the force velocity graph. And so this is her power velocity graph. I titled the chart Power Velocity Cadence because on the y-axis I have cadence instead of velocity in meters per second. So this is how you find the athlete's RPM naught. Is you look at where does her or his where does the peak power come from? So this athlete, she does her peak power at it says 100 RPM, but in actuality it's between 96 and 104 RPM. So to make this graph a little computationally easier and less rough, because a more granular version is actually pretty bad to look at. So each this is binned. So so imagine when you're sprinting, as you're accelerating, you start at maybe 95 RPM. Your next reading, the next second is 104 RPM. The next second is 111 RPM. So so we don't really get fine granular data for a lot of sprinting, but for our purposes, this is actually perfectly fine because it's also impossible to directly target those cadences and those speeds very precisely. So that's so this is somewhere I think you can actually be over precise, except perhaps for in track and BMX. But for just about every other discipline, this is actually perfectly sufficient, I find. So we can actually see that same parabola elsewhere. So this is a standing start. So we see as this athlete starts, from 0 meters per second and 0 watts, he goes through the he goes through the force velocity curve, gradually, reaching that sweet spot of peak power and then falling off again, but also falling off again for fatigue. So, so now I want to talk about rate of force development because this is the next big piece of the puzzle for figuring out sprint training and properly sprint training. So looking at this graph, this is graph of torque versus time from onset. So this is torque because I believe these were knee extensions, but the graph actually looks very similar for things like squats and deadlifts. So what happens is early on there's a rapid increase in force, and the change in force or torque by time is known as RFD, rate of force development. So the rate at which force develops. Excuse me. And over here, we see at the 400 to 500 millisecond range, this particular athlete reaches peak force, MVC, maximal voluntary contraction. So this is your strength training. If you want to increase the amount of load you can lift, you are increasing your maximal voluntary contraction. So, so what does this have to do with sprinting? So, so we can see here that in the first 125 milliseconds, remember that's as long as we have to develop force on the pedals at 120 RPM while sprinting. This is, we're not really reaching our peak force at all. So there are two ways to train this curve. It's strength training and power and speed training. So strength training will increase your maximal voluntary contractions for sure, but without doing any speed training here, you're really never going to see any increase in your sprint ability. Now there are studies out there that say that when you start strength training, you are going to get an increase in the early rate of force development here, and that is true up to a point. After the first 2, 3 weeks, maybe a month, those gains stop coming. So what we need to do is we need to periodize properly, as always, and so what we have here is my gross exaggeration of strength training and power and speed training. So strength training here, obviously you're not going to lose this much rate of force development, but it illustrates the point that you are going to increase force all the way out here at 400 to 500 milliseconds, maybe a second for the heaviest squats. You see a lot of experienced lifters in the gym. It can take them a full second, maybe a second and a half to finish a squat. And over here, if you just work on power and speed training, you're going to reach your particular maximum ability to produce force early on. So in this way, your absolute strength is kind of ceiling over your sprint ability. And I think this probably makes a lot of sense to everyone. So so to properly periodize, what we need to do is raise our strength and raise our speed so we actually get a curve that looks like this. So imagine the black line here is a baseline, and then you don't do any strength training, you just work on your speed, you do a lot of sprinting, you do a lot of ballistic explosive stuff in the gym, and you're going to increase your sprint because here you go, 125 milliseconds, you've increased the amount of force you can produce. Then you decide you're not fast enough, you go to the gym, you do some strength training, and then you come back and you do some more speed training, and what happens is you get to increase the force you can produce at these very short time periods even more. So talking about strength training, what we want to do in the gym with strength training is increase our maximal voluntary contraction, as we just saw, and rate of force development, as we just saw also, and unilateral neural drive and balance. So, so to talk about unilateral neural drive, because we just went through MVC and RFD. So to talk about unilateral neural drive, we're going to start here. Excuse me for 1 second while I get a sip of water. So on the x-axis, we have a percentage of maximal voluntary force production. So down here at 0, 0, we're looking at just getting up out of your chair. Up here at 100%, this is the absolute maximum you can produce. And on the y-axis, we have percentage of your maximal voluntary motor unit recruitment. So what is a motor unit? A motor unit is a nerve that comes from your spinal cord that attaches to a number of muscle fibers. And there are small and large motor units, motor units of varying size. So so what happens is, when you're not recruiting a lot of motor units and not producing a lot of force, down here getting up out of the chair, why would you need to get out the big guns? So according to Henneman's size principle, the motor units get recruited larger and larger until they hit a maximum recruitment rate at 90%, give or take, of maximal force production. And then from here, we rely on rate coding. So, so what rate coding looks like is this. So, so early on, producing low amounts of force and increasing amounts of force, we send more and more signal to our muscles to recruit more muscle fibers. And then once we get to a certain point, we actually have to start increasing the density of the signals. And so by increasing the firing frequency from our nerves to our muscles, and this makes them contract harder. So and so it's the grand sum of all of these signals that is neural drive. And so this high neural drive, this fast rate coding, this is the working area for sprinting. And for comparison, the working area for balance actually relies a lot more on rate coding. This is your hands, fine motor control, stuff like that, and a lot of the stabilizer muscles, small muscles, use this. So when we talk about balance, this is what we're talking about also. And also while we're here, I want to mention intention, as I did before. So if you always intend your movements to be as fast as possible, even if you are not moving that quickly, you are going to increase your neural drive. But not only that, if you intend your movements to be as fast as possible from as early as possible, you actually increase the strength of the signal early on in that 125 millisecond range that we're talking about for sprinting. So it's my personal philosophy to never really miss an opportunity to train that. And in a couple of slides, when I show you some lifts, I'll show you, how I do that in the gym. But first, I want to talk about unilateral neural drive by talking about bilateral and unilateral strength. So bilaterally, two legs contracting at the same time. To me, this is the best for whole body strength exercises. My main strength exercises for this for cyclists are the squat and the deadlift. And the bilateral strength that you can gain carries over really well to unilateral strength. And so how this works is your left brain hemisphere controls the right side of your body, and vice versa. Well, not the whole hemisphere, but you know what I mean. Maximal voluntary contractions require both hemispheres to activate motor units. But when we move over to unilateral contractions, your full brain is able to contribute neural drive to one leg. So you get all. So if you're contracting, your right leg, you're doing a one-leg trap bar deadlift, a very heavy one. You get all of your left brain sending signals to your right leg, but you also get some of your right brain sending signals to that leg. So you can actually, so by increasing the neural drive, you can actually get greater than 50% of your bilateral strength. And this is known as the bilateral deficit. It's a pretty well-recognized phenomenon, and it's my opinion. I don't have any evidence for this, but just in my experience as a cycling coach and as a strength and conditioning coach, that people have kind of like a ceiling to their unilateral neural drive. And once I find that they're hitting that ceiling in the gym, I'll switch back primarily to increasing bilateral strength before I go back to unilateral again. And unilateral strength, you might be asking why not train it all the time. It's really not well applied back to bilateral strength. And not only that, it's actually really hard on the stabilizer muscles, and people can actually be fairly injury prone doing a ton of unilateral stuff, especially a ton of heavy unilateral stuff. So so I try to keep the unilateral lifting to a kind of the minimum I feel the athlete needs to improve. So talking about strength training some more, in general, like I was just talking about, increase bilateral strength and then increase your unilateral neural drive. The speed is determined by load, but you always intend it to be fast. I'll talk more about this in a second. And this kind of goes with the next part. I only train the concentric part of lifts because in cycling we only have concentric action in the legs. So I don't train eccentric motions or stretch shortening cycles. Okay, so let's define some terms. So an eccentric motion, an eccentric contraction, is when the external force is greater than the force produced by the muscles. So, so imagine in the first part of a squat, you unrack the weight, and you're standing there, and then you start to lower your body. Your leg muscles are still contracting, but they're not producing force greater than the weight, so you are lowered. And then you, at the bottom of that lift, if you bounce, this is the stretch shortening cycle. This is the muscles elastically storing energy, and that gets you out of the bottom of your squat. And I don't train this, particularly while doing squats. I have athletes do pause squats. So at the bottom of the squat, get your thighs down to parallel or a little below. You know, stop, count 1 Mississippi, and then explode back up. So to me, this is you know, by bouncing at the bottom of the squat, you're missing an opportunity to train that first initial burst. So that's why I don't do that. But also, I find that eccentric motions make athletes, particularly cyclists who aren't used to them, very sore. So I try not to I try not to do too much of that. I'm cognizant of that. So specifically, in terms of strength training, rest a lot between sets, 4 minutes minimum, but I don't have a maximum. It's not uncommon for people to do 7, 10 minutes between sets. I recommend doing assistance lifts in between your main lifts to maximize the rest of those main muscle groups. So if you've got 2 or 3 triple extension lifts on the docket for your gym session, you're really not going to want to put them back to back. Kind of like having a long rest between sprints on the bike. This is very much the same principle. And for explosive triple extension lifts, when you're doing ballistic things, velocity targeting. And I'll show you how to do some velocity targeting in a little bit. So strength exercises, pause squats. Just talked about these a little bit. Bulgarian squats are my favorite unilateral strength lift, and deadlifts are my favorite neural drive lift. So there's a lot of ways that you can do deadlifts. My favorite for cyclists are trap bar deadlifts and single leg trap bar deadlifts. They just tend to they remove the lower back from the equation, and the lower back is an area of particular weakness for a lot of cyclists. So so I'm conscious of not hurting anybody's lower back too much. In terms of power lifts, 3 to 8 reps. Don't want to do too many of these at a time. Body weight or velocity targeted pause jump squats. Trap bar power pulls, which is just putting a light weight on the trap bar, locking out your arms and jumping, and sled throws or weighted jumps. So so you're going to notice that these are all jumps. So the reason I do this is because for well, I know that some strength and conditioning coaches advocate just doing standard squats with light weights, but what I find happens is that at the top of those lifts, imagine if your squat, if your 1 rep max is 200 pounds, and imagine if you just do a squat as fast as you can with just the bar. At the top of that lift, you're actually in danger of hurting your knees, and so what your body does subconsciously is it engages your antagonist muscles to slow your movement at the top of that, and that's what we don't want to do. We want to maintain our triple extension velocity as fast as possible for as long through that extension as possible. So with jumps, we actually get a lot less antagonist recruitment. So for me, those are the proper power lifts. And if you're wondering if Olympic lifts are useful, in my opinion, they are not at all useful for training sprints. First of all, they're a little technical, so spending the time to properly teach a cyclist to do those lifts, I think there's better time spent elsewhere. They also require upper body strength, which a lot of cyclists, especially road riders, don't want to put on. And not only that, in terms of the demands on the legs for Olympic lifts, they're not specific enough to cycling to me. So I don't do Olympic lifts with any cyclist. If I were because I do strength and conditioning coaching as well, and if I were going to be doing strength and conditioning coaching for a volleyball team, yeah, there would absolutely be Olympic lifts, but not for cycling. So assistance lifts, these are all meant to either strengthen or just engage a lot of the smaller muscles from the ankles up through the posterior chain down to the hands. So single leg calf raises, I recommend doing these, put a plate on the floor, put the barbell on your back, and then put your toes up on the plate on the floor, and then do them like that. This is great for balance. This is, even if you're a road rider and you don't think you need a lot of balance exercises, this is great to work your stabilizers. Single leg knee extensions and flexions, bent over barbell rows, and weighted decline bench crunches. I don't have a lot of people do high rep crunches. I think that you might as well be riding a bike if you want that kind of core strength. But just talking about actual strength, actually building the amount of weight that you can hold up by doing crunches, to me is a lot more useful. And in terms of athlete and discipline specific exercises, balance ball squats, this is the really targeted balance exercise. I use this a lot for mountain bikers and cyclocross riders, BMX racers, anybody for whom they have to negotiate interesting terrain. Renegade rows, overhead press. These again I find useful for people like mountain bikers who have to absorb a lot of bumps with the upper body. Lunges are a good alternative glute exercise to Bulgarian squats if you have issues doing that. And stretching is not really specific to any athlete or discipline, but I think everybody should stretch a lot, especially after you lift. So here I have example neural sessions, what I call neural sessions. This takes advantage of a phenomenon called post-activation potentiation. So you do something heavy, and then you do something light and fast. So in terms of a bilateral session, I'll give athletes do some barbell deadlifts, warm-up sets up to 3 to 5 rep max, and then rest a little bit, do 5 sets of 2 to 5 body weight or velocity targeted pause jump squats. And in terms of unilateral, single leg trap bar deadlifts, warm-up sets of 3 up to 3 rep max, 2 to 3 sets after that of 4 leg press sled throws. Those are a lot of fun. So if you haven't done a leg press sled throw, try it. So how this works is by doing something that really warms up your neural drive from the brain, because the brain needs to warm up too. So once you get into that that high rate coding, that really dense neural drive area, the brain keeps doing that. So when you move on to doing something light and fast, you actually produce more power, and you actually contract faster. So for example, a couple months ago, I was in the gym with some of my athletes, and I put my movement tracker on both of them, and we started off with the first exercise that we did was body weight pause jump squats. I remember both of them peaked at 4,000 watts, and then I had them do deadlifts up to their 3 to 5 rep max, because they both just happened to be experienced lifters, so I didn't give them trap bar. And then I had them rest a little bit and then do another pause bodyweight jump squat. And immediately, that first one, they peaked at 6,000 watts. And the speed was faster, and the average speed, peak speed were faster, average watts were faster, force was higher. So, so these really work in order to get you moving faster if that is one of your particular goals. So how do we do velocity targeting? This is a file from one of my athletes' mountain bike races. So, so when I do velocity targeting for her, what I do is I grab one of her mountain bike races and I select chunks of her race in 3 to 8 minute bits. Excuse me for a second. And I look at the scatter plot for CPV versus power because trying to get a random representative sample of the race. So what I'm looking at is where does she produce a lot of power? So so first thing is obvious that we can kind of see the beginnings of the parabola. So this, so the power velocity parabola. So I would assume that all of these contractions are about 90%, but I'm thinking where does she spend the most time? She spends the most time anywhere from about 0.6 meters per second to 1.5 to 1.75 meters per second or so. So so what I'll do is I'll spend most of her velocity targeting looking for an average extension speed of 1.5 meters per second, and then for other days I'll target lower. She doesn't spend a lot of time here, but I'll talk with her and see would it be useful to have more power at your lower cadences. So that's something that you can work with your athletes or consider yourself. I see a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to get to you guys at the end. Sorry, I just want to make sure we have enough time for the presentation, and if people need to leave at the end. So I see them coming in. I'll get to you guys. I think I already answered the one about Olympic lifts. Okay, so velocity targeting. Up here at the top, this is a high volume squat day for me. So what I want to show you here is the average velocity for some heavy squats. So we can see that almost all of these are between 2 and 3 meters per second. So these are very heavy. These are very slow. So not a big speed day here. And on the bottom, I'm showing you peak velocity for bilateral pause jump squats, and this is with 155 pounds because for the day I was looking for about 1 meter per second average. But the way that I look at an athlete, if they're, how many sets should they do? What I do is I look at peak speed, and I see, how many sets are they doing until they start to fatigue. So here I started to dip under 2 meters per second peak. Mostly it was 2.1 to 2.5, and as soon as I started, I saw 2 reps under 2 meters per second. I knew it was time to call it a day. But you really want to maintain that speed because, as I said before, your adaptations are velocity specific. All right, fun stuff on the bike. Pmax, of course, and our FRC, of course. We can do a lot of RFD training, rate of force development on the bike, and leg speed, and so so Pmax and sprint training. So the first exercise to do is a classic. You're going to target 95 to 100% of your Pmax. You're going to do 4 to 8 sprints, 6 seconds each, from 20 plus miles an hour, and you're going to start your sprints at RPM optimal cadence minus 10 RPM, 10 to 15 minute rests. So the reason I have people do it like this, do a lot of sprints, from an initial high speed and a targeted cadence like this, is because well, first of all, for high speed, you're not actually when you sprint, you don't actually gain that much speed in a couple seconds. Um, so you don't really have to do any shifting. And also RPM optimal cadence minus 10 RPM. So if you know your RPM optimal is in, say, the 110 RPM bin, you're going to start your sprint at 100 RPM. And so that way, as you accelerate, you are going to be working your leg velocity around your Pmax for 6 seconds. So that is meant to drive up your Pmax. On the right, we have capacity sprints. I'm not for capacity, I'm not a short repeated effort kind of person, especially for training like this. I prefer to stress the body for longer periods of time and give it a lot of rest to really rebuild those stores. So targeting 100 to 150% Pmax extensive duration at RPM optimal. So this is your eye level 7. Go for the extensive duration, start at Pmax extensive duration, and then build up to 150%. And you're going to look to average RPM optimal. So your average sprint, say it's 15 seconds, and your RPM optimal is 110 RPM. You're going to look to average 110 RPM for that sprint. So 4 to 8 sprints as usual, from 20 plus miles an hour and 20-minute rests. So you really want to give your legs a break. Overgeared starts, 110 to 140 gear inches, which I know sounds ridiculous, but I know for a fact that there are some track sprinters around who are perfectly capable of doing 140 gear inches. At about the same spinning up the gear rate as somebody like me would be able to do. So you're going to do 4 sets of 3, 8-second starts with 90-second rests in between your starts, and then during the sets, and then between the sets you give yourself 15 minutes. So this is actually a really good bike-specific neural drive kind of day, and what you can actually see, which is really cool, is your peak power from each of these starts will likely increase for each start until you start to fatigue. So if your peak power for each start starts at like 800 watts, likely your second one is going to be 820 or 830, maybe 850. Your third start, you might peak at like 900 watts. So it's pretty cool to see your brain actually turning on throughout those sessions. FRC hills, this is a really good one. Rolling start into a 4 to 6% hill, and then you're going to do 6 reps at Pmax/FRC duration. Go to the eye levels and make sure you pick a duration that makes sense for you. And you're going to do 15 to 30-minute rests. And it's to me, it's really important to rest, as fully as you need to, especially as you become a better sprinter. You're going to be able to bury yourself really hard, and ask any track sprinter who can do 1,000 watts for 30 seconds, but they've got a 200 watt FTP. How do they feel after their 30-second efforts? So give yourself as much rest as you feel you need. And the average cadence for these, I recommend I recommend they be velocity targeted. So if I were going to be assigning these to my mountain biker from earlier, I would assign one day I would assign like 60 RPM, another day I would assign 75 RPM as the target average cadence for those. In terms of rate of force development and leg speed training, undergeared sprints target Pmax extensive duration, RPM optimal plus 10 RPM at speed, plus 20 RPM for track racers, 4 to 8 sprints from 20 to 30 miles an hour, 20-minute rests. So what this does is it gives your legs even less time than RPM optimal in order to produce that force on the pedals. So this trains your body to produce more force in less amount of time. Cadence ladders, these are really fun, good for a rest day. No power target, just leg speed, so keep it in small gear. Start at 100 RPM. At 5 RPM every 20 seconds. There's no top to this. You just go until you, you just go until you top out, and then you can do it again And after you top out, say you top out at 150 RPM, you're going to notice that 100 RPM feels very slow. So that's always really cool to do. Light speed sprints, 6-10-second sprints on rollers or on a trainer in a small gear or with no resistance. So when I was talking about in the force velocity curve, hooking up your bike to a trainer and not stitching up the resistance wheel, yeah, I have people do that. And we see very, very high peak leg speeds. So the reason leg speed is important when you're sprinting is because you want to really make sure that your legs are not working against each other. So so your brain gets really good at timing the contractions of your legs. And so this is particularly important if you're in a sport or if you're in a discipline like track sprinting or BMX, where you're looking at 150 RPM, 180 RPM, 200 RPM as something that you're going to see in competition. So so it's actually not unusual to see an elite track racer being able to do sprints like this at well over 250 RPM. Okay, so how do we track sprinting? So this is a sprint stress tracking chart that I made. I borrowed a bunch of ideas from the regular PMC. So what we see here is in terms of sprint stress, the yellow bars here, STSS, sprint TSS, this is the kilojoules that you burn in eye levels 7 and 7A. So Pmax and Pmax/FRC per day. So so we can see here in the blue, the shaded blue here in the background, this is the training load function using so we get a sprint CTL. So we have a chronic training load of how many kilojoules you're spending while sprinting, doing ballistic contractions. And in the background, we have the light blue here. This is your regular CTL. In case you want to see that, you can increase the opacity of it. I've got it pretty dull. And then in the purple here, the pink, rather, this is your sprint ATL. So I've never really used this. I've never seen it get too high for anybody. Because sprinting is kind of a self-limiting thing. You can really only do so much of it in a day, or even in a week. So so I just watch this to make sure that somebody's not going too hard for too long. And so so what I find is that Sprint CTL actually tracks really well with Pmax, and I looked at this over a variety of athletes and disciplines to make sure that that it was kind of a robust chart. And anytime I'm tracking somebody's Pmax, I use this chart. So so the last thing I have here is Pmax/FRC. This is not the eye level. This is an actual ratio of watts per kilojoules. Your Pmax watts just divided by your FRC kilojoules. So if you've got a Pmax of 1,000 and an FRC of 15, this is 1,000 divided by 15. So the reason I did this is because, sorry, let me find my mouse. The reason I did this is because there is leverage on FRC with your sprints. Because, obviously if you increase your sprint power, you increase the kilojoules that you can expend above your threshold. So if you, well, I'll show you this. So this is the PD curve leverage from Andy Coggan. So what we see here is that at 1 second, we have full leverage on both Pmax and FRC. And the leverage starts to decline rapidly for Pmax, of course, down to about 100 seconds. And for FRC, it declines pretty rapidly. And at 100 seconds, we're only looking at 0.15 or so leverage on FRC. So the reason I have the Pmax FRC ratio here is because as I watch Pmax increase, so this athlete increased their Pmax from a little over 1,600 watts to the upper 1,800s in this time period, and so we saw a very large increase in FRC, like think it was like 10 or 15 kilojoules or something, but the ratio stayed pretty well the same. So this says to me that that the FRC intervals that this athlete's targeting, you know, that means that that the increase in the power that we see in the FRC intervals are because of the increase in Pmax, not because the athlete was working in FRC at all. So that's how I keep track of that. In terms of periodizing, you know, this is pretty standard stuff. What are the demands of the goal event in terms of Pmax and FRC? What is the importance of maximal strength? And what are the force velocity demands? So, you know, pretty much the same stuff we've been going through the lens of your goal event. Chronic training compatibility. Now there is interference of strength training with aerobic development, but that has a big asterisk with it. In my experience as a coach, I see that this is where there is the largest amount of individual variation. You know, some athletes are perfectly capable of lifting once or twice a week while developing their aerobic ability. And some athletes, you know, you have them lift once a week, and you know they have a hard time doing their doing their threshold intervals a couple days later because you know they get sore or something like that. So so this is you know, making the two work together is very difficult, and I always recommend people get a second set of eyes when they're planning their season out like this. And I also recommend that people don't fall in love with the gym, and I'll show you guys a little bit of that in the next slide. Specific to athletes, obviously, again, look at the athlete's limiters. You know, does the athlete need strength maintenance in terms of you know, can they keep muscle mass on if that's one of the things you want, or not? What is the associated fatigue with strength and sprint training? And does the athlete need any sprint CTL maintenance? I find most of the time that yes, athletes do need sprint CTL maintenance, but it's individual to the athlete. Some athletes can hold on to their Pmax a little better than others. For endurance disciplines, this is how I generally approach periodization, and this is particularly looking at road racing right here. So during the transition phase, I like to do a lot of strength training. In the gym, we'll do adaptation to strength training, you know, getting the bones a little more dense, getting the tendons a little thicker, you know, getting the athlete used to the techniques again, and doing some balance work. And on the bike, we're going to focus on leg speed and do some technique work. You know, working your starts, do some position adaptation if you're changing positions. You know, this is a great time to do that. I'm sure, you know, all of you are already aware of that. During the base phase, I switch up the Pmax focus into strength and speed. Here I do heavy and medium weight focus with some light weights. And on the bike, I'll focus a lot on Pmax and low velocity. So a lot of you know, a lot of big gear standing starts, a lot of tractor pulls, that kind of stuff. During the build phase in the gym, I really focus a lot on speed. So we'll go for a lot of light weights and ballistic training, possibly strength maintenance once to twice per training cycle, depending on the athlete, if I feel that they need it. And on the bike, we'll focus on rate of force development and high velocity stuff. And also FRC and fatigue resistance, as you always do during a build phase. During the peak and race phases, you're just going to maintain minimum necessary SCTL and no lifting in the gym. So having good sprint performances for athletes, to me, this requires a lot of freshness. So you really, you know, say an athlete is, you know, banking on winning a sprint in a criterium at their goal event, you really need to balance the endurance training load with the sprint training load to make sure that the athlete is capable of producing their best sprint at the end of that event. So a little more on periodization. So this is periodizing a sprinter. So at the end of 2016 road season, we see the green line here in the bottom. This is this athlete's baseline. So then we had him do some strength training. So because adaptations are velocity specific, we see the low velocity, the low RPM watts coming up, as we would expect. And we see the RPM optimal shift left 2 bins from the 120 RPM bin to the 100 RPM bin. And then, doing some strength speed training, it shifts to the right again, and we have a large increase in Pmax as well. And then during speed training, this athlete's only been doing speed training for about 2 weeks now, I think, and there was a large enough increase already in Pmax to show you. And this is a long process too. So from pre-sprint training to through strength training was a couple months, and from strength training through strength speed training was also a couple months. And then doing speed training, that was just been a couple weeks now. So these are the what do you call it? The force velocity graphs that correspond to the previous graph that I just showed you, without the speed training on top, because it was pretty much the same as the strength speed training, and it got a little cluttered. So here we see the same stuff happening. So we see pre-sprint training here. We see strength training. We see the low velocity force increase, and then during strength speed we see the whole curve increase again. And we can see the same story described over here with the descriptors. So one more way I look at periodization is, like I said, I like to break up the force velocity curve into 3 sections. So so here we see the athlete doing strength training in the blue, the low velocity. So we see that the watts for low velocity come up to a peak, and then as the athlete backs off on the strength training, we see that peak kind of maintained. And then in the high RPM values here in the red, we see that increasing once the athlete starts doing strength speed work. And then and we see what we always hope to see is in the sweet spot here in the middle, the watts just pretty consistently coming up. So a couple more slides, 3 left. So we have periodization. This is a graph of power versus angular velocity for knee extensions. So so these athletes did 3 months of training of the knee extensions, heavy strength training, followed by 3 months of full V training. So so what we see is the whole curve increases, of course, and then after doing stopping for 3 months, we see a return almost to baseline for low angular velocities, but at high angular velocities we see a very large increase. And so this is one of the reasons that I caution people, people who need to sprint with high leg velocity, to not fall in love with the gym, because 120 RPM is 720 degrees per second. And if anybody knows anything about the physiology of this, one of the reasons that this adaptation occurs is because during full D training, the body actually develops super fast twitch muscles again, which usually deplete or are converted back to the semi-fast twitch like type 2A and type 2X from type 2B. But the same principle still applies when we periodize sprint training. So last 2 things I have for you guys is on aerodynamics. So on the right here we have 2 events, white circles in one event and dark circles is the second event. And on the y-axis we have the velocity in meters per second for a flying 200, average velocity. And on the x-axis what we have is the ratio of Pmax to the projected frontal surface area. How much surface area in square meters is this cyclist showing to the wind? And so we actually see a pretty good correlation with this, 0.75 for the white circle event and 0.63 for the dark circle event. However, on the left here, I noted that when when sprint times are correlated with both Pmax per surface area and optimal pedaling rate, RPM optimal, the correlation goes up to 0.96. So this is a very, very strong correlation. So so for these track sprinters, the higher the optimal pedaling rate, along with having a good watts per surface area, resulted in the best 200 meter times. And most importantly, no relationship was found normalized to body weight. So if you're in a discipline where you don't see a lot of competition for gravity, you know, track sprinters especially kind of like linebackers sometimes, and it's because, you know, the body weight is actually not that big a deal. So, you know, if you're only doing flat criteriums, you know, don't be afraid to gain a few extra pounds for those extra watts, because they really do make a big difference. And so this is the last graph I want to show you guys. This was made for me by one of my MIT athletes, and Bert Ozturk, who's at the he's in the Aero Astro program. So thank you, Bert. This is speed versus drag power for different frontal for different drag coefficients. So we see, you know, so in the previous slide we saw speeds, you know, around 18 to 20 meters per second. So we're looking here, and you know, and we can certainly reach peak speeds of higher than 20 meters per second doing sprinting on the track. So so you know, so we actually get a very large increase in speed for a relatively you know, for what would be a relatively small decrease in your aerodynamic drag versus at slower speeds. So so if you care about your final speed during sprinting and you're not doing aerodynamic testing, you are really leaving a lot of speed on the table. So that's all I have for you guys. This is my email. So I'm going to get to some questions now. So if you have any more questions after this webinar, you can feel free to email me at empiricalcycling@gmail.com. All of the charts are up in the library. I checked it this morning. They're there. So so question: does the rate of change when discussion rate coding and neural drive change as the athlete gets older, say 50 plus years? This model shows the same for men and women of all ages. So does rate coding and neural drive change as the athlete gets older? The answer is I don't know. I was actually asked this question last night. I didn't see the questions myself. Tim was reading them to me, so I don't know if it was you, but yeah, somebody else asked the same question last night. And the answer is I don't know. Every time I have seen a bunch of studies on it, but I've never read them. I kind of I skip over them. I don't coach you know, anybody over 50. I do coach a couple 40s, but yeah. So unfortunately, I don't have an answer for you. You know, email me and I can get back to you on that. So how do you remove the eccentric phase during the squat? By doing pause squats. So you cannot actually remove the eccentric phase of a squat, but when you do plyometrics and stuff like that, for most other sports, you actually do need to think about the stretch shortening cycle and the eccentric cycle. So by descending slowly during your pause squats is a good way to prevent your muscles from storing a lot of energy. If you descend fast and bounce hard, you're storing a lot of energy in your muscles. So that's how so that's my recommendation for avoiding those. So if you don't have a leg press in the gym, what other neural drive exercise would suffice for unilateral? Unilateral deadlifts, single leg deadlifts on the trap bar. Those are my absolute favorite. So you know, you put your leg in the middle of the trap bar that you're going to lift on. Put your left leg, pick it up like an inch or two off the floor and squeeze that against your other ankle, and then lock out your arms and then pick up the trap bar. So, so that's my neural drive for my favorite unilateral neural drive exercise. Are there any other questions? Feel free to type away. Okay, I think that is it. All right, everybody. So thank you for attending. And you know, as I said before, you feel free to email me any questions that I didn't get back to, or if you have any questions later. All right. All right. Thank you, Debbie, again, and thank you everybody for attending. Okay. Bye bye.